So the way the project works, it's set up like this. We've taken the data from previous studies to review what the flood and erosion zones will look like in the future. From that, we've identified citywide risks, not just to transportation, but to the city as a whole. And you'll be able to weigh in during a survey on which of those risks are important to you. Then we've identified a suite of options for solutions. And again, you'll be able to identify on the survey which ones appeal to you and explore them in detail on some maps. Tonight, we're here to gather your input, which, as Frederick just mentioned, is a critically important portion of this project. And then finally, we're going to use your input to narrow down those adaptation options from more than 23, depending on how you count, down to 3 option packages for the city to move forward and consider in the future. So let's start by just a quick review of what those current flood predictions say is coming up for Monterey. This slide shows FEMA flood zones, and these were redone in 2018, with sea levels at the height they are now. So here you'll see the area that would flood in the city should a large storm hit tomorrow, a storm that has a chance of recurring about once every 100 years. And in dark gray is a larger flood area that would occur with a larger flood, one that occurs perhaps once every 500 years. Something I do want to share, though, is that FEMA flood projections are based on what historical floods have done. And I think we've all seen that across the country, large storms are really changing. They're increasing in frequency and also in intensity. So, for instance, certain areas in Texas, including Houston, have seen multiple 1,000-year floods just in the past 5 years. So these events have been rare in the past. They may be less rare in the future. Up here in orange, you'll see an area that is not currently expected to flood, but would be affected by large storms. So let's look at future flooding. Here in light blue, you'll see the areas that would flood with less than a foot of flooding, 0.7 feet of flooding. And this is the area that is projected to flood just 10 years from now. So mostly just around the edges of existing lakes, but critically across Del Monte Avenue, which cuts off a major transportation route for your city. Moving forward to 2.4 feet of flooding. This is projected by mid-century, maybe 2060, depending on how fast seas rise. I'm going to go back and forth so you can see the light blue of 2030 and then a different shade of blue again for 2060. So larger areas of the city flooding, small residential areas as well. And then end of century, 5.2 feet of flooding. And this is the light green. And here we've got the intersection with Highway 1 intersected in much larger residential areas of the city. So let's talk about what that looks like in a different way. Right now, mean high water is sort of the daily high tide level, the average daily high tide in Monterey, and it's 5.4 feet in elevation above sea level, what we think of as zero. And once a month, your tides get, on average, up to 6.5 feet above sea level. So if we look at those numbers I just talked about, this is the predicted monthly high water elevation in Monterey in the future. So now water is reaching to 6.5 feet by end of century, closer to 11.5 feet, or your day or monthly high tides, or your area that essentially is ocean. So what that does in terms of impacts, here's some examples. By 2030, here's your tide levels. Parts of Del Monte Avenue permanently lost. The tides completely swamp the road to the tunnel by 2060, though the tunnel may be vulnerable long before then to waves. When we add in those FEMA large storms, that FEMA 100-year storm, right now, with current sea levels, a 100-year storm would swamp the deck at Municipal Wharf too. That same size storm, a 100-year storm, would reach Cannery Row, the elevation of the street at the aquarium, by mid-century, is what's predicted. So you can explore these flood levels yourself. You can zoom in. You can get really close to properties that are of particular interest to you on an online map that we've prepared for the city that's accessible to the public. We'll give you that address at the end of this presentation, and you'll see this control bar on the side of it, and you can just turn on and off different levels of flooding and see which areas are going to be impacted. So Frederick's going to talk about the consequences to the city, and also very specifically to traffic, if we do nothing to prepare for sea level rise.
So I think you will recall this picture back from a few years ago when Del Monte flooded. This was temporary flooding during a storm. It receded rather, and eventually these will happen more and more and will result in permanent land loss. The next is that after the flooding happened, we see the waves that Rebecca spoke about. So with increased waves, we see increased erosion of the beachfront, and also eventually that erosion will happen for the Monterey Bay Scenic Trail as well. And we'll see increased wave impacts that will result in this kind of erosion where the beach had to be resanded again. There is also sort of a hidden damage that we don't see until it actually happens, and that's when the ocean's backflow through our stormwater drains in our sewers underneath the roads. And this is a picture of San Francisco a couple of years ago, where the damage caused by this kind of flooding was well in excess of $5 million. We're now going to look at some volumes and looking specifically, what would happen with traffic, as we see this flooding occur. So this slide shows us 2040 daily volumes that would occur on the city street. The first one I want you to notice is actually Del Monte Avenue, where we see about 46,000 cars a day, a substantial amount of cars, and then also specifically the Lighthouse Tunnel, where it increases to 57,000 cars a day. Now, these are the two biggest road sections that will be impacted. If we look at Pearl and Fremont, Pearl almost has no traffic because it's really local serving right now. Fremont, about 30,000 cars a day. So on the next slide, we're going to now see what happens if we start losing the roads. The first one is with a 0.7 feet sea level rise, about 2030 conditions, and we lose Del Monte Avenue and the Lighthouse Tunnel. So that 57,000 cars through the tunnel needs to go elsewhere, or where do they go? Part of it, the biggest shift is to Pearl and also to Fremont Street. But this traffic also shifts elsewhere in the city. So if we look at where those occur, of course, the way to get around is once the traffic gets pushed elsewhere, it goes through downtown. So we can see an increase on Pacific, and then cars want to take the back road, which is then up David and Prescott. And eventually it pushes down to Highway 68, where we see an increase in volumes as well. And then I want you to look at some of the negatives here, specifically that there's an overall decrease that starts to happen in cars coming into the city. That's on the right-hand side of the screen, and then you can see the substantial decrease in volumes on Lighthouse and on Foam Street as well. Next, we move into what happens if we have 2.4 feet of sea level rise, and that's about mid-century. So now Del Monte floods, the tunnel floods, and also Pearl floods. We need to get rid of more vehicles, or more vehicles in the system needs to relocate and find other routes to get into the city. We're now going to look at where some of those increases happen. So on the next slide, the first one is, again, where are the gaps right now? So we saw it going to Fremont Street, bigger increase through downtown, and then, of course, still the back route along David, Prescott, and Highway 68. On the next slide, you will see how the negatives actually increase, especially the ones on the left-hand side, that more and more people cannot get to the city. So we see that net loss of traffic coming into Monterey. The following slide is in 2100 conditions where we lose all three roads. So you will remember that from the maps that Rebecca showed: Fremont floods, Pearl floods, Del Monte, and Betamo floods. So this is where we start seeing total gridlock in the system. If we look at where all the increases are now, and they are substantial on the next slide, is, David and Prescott, they are way over their capacity in terms of they can carry. Look how the volumes go and increase on through downtown, and also now we see substantial pushes through next to the Del Monte Center along Monraz, and then also Highway 68. Quite substantially here is also now the loss in traffic that cannot get into the city at all. So we see reductions, especially on the east side. And then, of course, on the west side, Lighthouse and Foam will be very quiet streets. So on the next slide, we're going to look at the better story of what happens at specific locations. Now, this one shows you the how volumes change from the base year through the three sea level rise scenarios, and this is specifically at Highway 68, just past the Chomp Hospital. So you can see we have about 18,000 cars a day in 2040 conditions, how it increases to about 25 and still tries to increase to about 27,000 cars a day by when we see the 5.2 feet sea level rise. The next slide shows you, if we do the same sort of graphic and we look at the locations on Del Monte and on specifically Highway 1 at Aguajiro and also on Mark Thomas Drive. So you can see Del Monte closure, how the volumes go down significantly. Highway 1 at Aguajiro goes up significantly, and then on Mark Thomas is where you can see that it goes up, and eventually it goes down. And that going down in 5.2 feet sea level rise is because of that vehicles are just now sort of leaving the city because they cannot get into the city. So on the next slide, what does this do for us, right? If we don't take any action on sea level rise, public safety is at risk. Fire cannot respond, EMRs cannot respond in a timely fashion. How do they get around? If they're on the east side and you got to get to the west side, do you get around? It's going to be congested. Also, there will be big impacts on tourism and businesses that will decline. We saw the reduction in traffic on those slides. How do people actually get to the hotels? How do they come and enjoy the scenic and great lifestyle and the aquarium in the city of Monterey? And residents will be displaced. And then ultimately, the mobility and our daily activities will be severely disrupted.
So we have crafted a range of options for solutions, and we just want to emphasize once again, your input matters, and we want to make sure you're fully informed. So we're going to talk about sort of two overarching strategies with subcategories of options under each. And the first strategy is coastal flood protection. So here in this picture, you can see existing sea level is light blue, and these buildings are up above it. But future sea level in dark blue, they're not above that. These low-lying houses or businesses could be protected by a seawall, a dike, a levee, a number of different options. But then they will exist below sea level. So the option to that is something called managed retreat. Which is where we literally just let the sea take what it's going to take, or at least a portion of that, and move our people out of the risk zone. And actually, Monterey is a great candidate for this, because if you look at those flood maps, a lot of what floods is already lake, and the land areas that are flooding are not a huge portion of the total geography of the city, because you've got those lovely steep hills rising up. so managed retreat becomes possible while maintaining the city in a way that we love living in it, which is not true for some low-lying cities. So each of these options, as I said, you'll be able to explore online, starting with the flood protection. So when you go to that online map, look over here on the left and click that box for flood protection. And there's different portions of the city that are represented. You can see these highlighted areas. That doesn't tell you a lot. So if you click again on any of the individual details, it will pull up some sort of illustration of what that option would be and a description with the pros and the cons of each of those options. And at each area in the city that's going to flood, we've presented you with more than one option. So 15 total options there to explore on the maps and then rate on the surveys. The benefits of flood protection are we maintain existing land uses without disruption. The concerns, however, are significant. Flood protection is very costly to build, and it's also costly to maintain. The thing we need to understand about sea level rise is it's going to go on for the foreseeable future, not just the end of century, but for centuries beyond that. So if we build walls or levees that would protect us to 2100, at some point we will need to raise those walls. And we also need to add an extra safety lever there because of large storms and waves. Draining the city grows increasingly more difficult and more expensive. Frederick talked about how the ocean can actually flow backwards up through our storm drains as seas rise, and groundwater will rise, sewage discharge will be impacted. And so there's a lot of costs with changing the drainage infrastructure in the city so that when rain falls, we can still have dry streets and dry homes. And then, of course, there's safety concerns for anyone who's living or working below future sea levels. We know there are areas around the world, such as Amsterdam, that have lived below sea level successfully for many, many years. New Orleans lived below sea level, portions of it successfully, until Hurricane Katrina. I don't know of any city that has successfully lived below sea level protected by walls or dikes that is in a seismically active zone. So there's an added element of engineering for those flood protections that would require them to be earthquake safe as well. And that's an untested thing. We've not done that before. So the alternative is carefully managed retreat. So we're back looking at this flood map, and if we imagine that these flooded areas just are ocean, or at least some portion of them, here are the specific roads in blue that would need to be adjusted so that we don't have the total gridlock that Frederick was talking about. So you click on the managed retreat transportation options here on the right, and each of those will pull up a description again with the pros and cons. So putting reversible lanes on Pearl Street allows traffic to flow more freely during rush hour. Or up on Del Monte, we could get crazy and convert that to a really beautiful viaduct or a bridge type situation. It could be for pedestrians or for automobiles, and each of those options are explorable with their pros and their cons. This is not completely pie in the sky or crazy. We haven't made up the idea of managed retreat. In fact, FEMA's been funding managed retreat since the 1980s, and these little black dots show you every voluntary FEMA property buyout because of repeat flooding since 1989. There's been many, many thousands of these around the country and down along the Gulf Coast and up along the Northeast coast. A lot of that repeat flooding is coastal surge. combined with sea level rise. So what happens if we were to consider managed retreat is that at-risk land would be bought from willing owners and very gradually, as seas gradually rise, converted to open space and water. We would have to adjust traffic. We would have to put in temporary flood protection to make sure that storm floods don't do much damage as we gradually adjust. And then the managed retreat concerns. It could mean saying no to new development in certain low-lying areas of the city, or along Cannery Row requiring higher flood protection and storm wave protection, or requiring property owners to plan to remove properties as seas rise in those risky areas. We have to figure out how we fund buyouts, just as we would have to figure out how we fund flood protection. And in the past, there's been money from FEMA and from the state to do both of those things. There's the question of what if sellers aren't willing? And then there's how would Monterey look after we did this? And all of those can be explored in the surveys and in the maps that I've talked about. So once more, this is just how to use those online interactive maps. I've already demonstrated and showed it to you, but so you have it here. You can explore both the flood predictions and the solutions by turning flood layers on and off, turning flood protection layers on and off, turning transportation solutions on and off, and then clicking on each of those options to get more detail. So we hope you'll do that. Spend a little time with those maps and those options before you take the survey, so you really feel like you know what those options are. Because we need your help. We do believe that working together, we can keep people and infrastructure safe. We can keep Monterey moving. We can work with rising seas rather than against them and sustain our coastal future. Imagine how Monterey could be.
is being referred to with the city limit lines. But Joe, are you pulling up a map? It looks to be perhaps on slide 11.
Okay, I'll just, sorry for the quick scrolling, folks.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm might want to pass on this question and answer it offline, because I don't believe that we put in political boundaries on these lines, or we did not intend to do so. We meant to show simply an aerial, a satellite view with the overlay to make it clear where flood waters would be.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. On slide 14, and I'm just wondering whether or not some of these questions refer to the plan itself, because they are saying page. So if you're the person that asked those questions, if you don't mind just getting back in touch with us to confirm some of the page numbers that you're referencing. We'll come back to that later. Frederick, we've had a question about the primary mode of sand transport along the shore. So there's a question about some of the people involved in the Southern Monterey Bay Coastal Erosion Work Group said that sand is primarily transported transversely to the shore, that is on and off shore. So which is it? If it is along the shore, would groins be an option to slow erosion?
So for the sand, right now we look at sea level rise, right? And the sea level rise will erode with wave action and also with the actual increase in sea level height. And then we look at how that impacts the land. I don't know if Rebecca wants to respond to if we import more sand that could potentially help delay or prevent ocean or sea level rise or storm surge.
Sure. Joe, could you take us, please, to slide, let me see, slide number 63.
Sure thing.
No, this is 22.
Sorry, say that again.
There we go. Okay. So one of the options that we've talked about, or that we've included in the options you can explore online and rate, is what's sometimes called an ecotone levee, which is wider than a typical levee and includes habitat, plantings, etc. And you'll see in this illustration, we also included some berms that are meant to catch and retain sand. Beach enhancement on its own at current elevations of the beach would not be expected to be adequate to hold back mid-century to late century levels of sea level rise. If you go now, please, Joe, to slide 12.
Sure, there might just be a quick flash and a little hold.
There we go. I don't know if you can see, but if you look right down along where Del Monte Avenue first floods, where little bits of blue are first crossing Del Monte, we're talking about very, very small areas of Del Monte that flood on their own without any storm waves. This is a very calm day. There's no wave action at all. Tiny areas of Del Monte are flooding by 2030 at protected levels. Could raising the dunes via beach enhancement protect against that level of flooding? There's a stronger likelihood. In the near term, just some beach enhancement could buy some time. It would need to be checked for engineering, and the city also needs to consider what level of storm they want to protect against, because as I said, this is no storm at all. This is flat calm water.
Great. Thank you so much. We've had a clarification that some of the questions about specific page numbers refers to the study document itself, not the slides. So we might have to take those questions on notice and come back to you. Thank you. So we've had a question about one of the main primary problems in the area is that as sea level rises, rainwater will not be able to flow by gravity into the ocean at certain times. So the berming that has been done for many years addresses only the wave run-up, but it doesn't address longer term, as in many minutes or hours episodes of elevated sea level rise.
That's exactly right. And it also doesn't address the pooling that will happen as rain flows down from the hills and collects. Currently, the rain flows out through storm drains, and you may get a slight rise in water in the 3 lakes in the downtown area. But as seas rise, that rainwater will not be able to flow by gravity. And any sewer flow that goes by gravity could also be impeded. And we have not done those specific studies. It would be a recommended next step for the city, but in every single one of the flood protection options, you will see that under there's a bullet that says, so if you just go to the map, can you go to the map online, Joe?
The Google Map one?
Yep.
I can bring it up if you...
Not, that's okay. Let me figure out what slide I can go to. Just go please to slide number 32.
Okay, I now have it up. So if you just give me 1 minute.
The map? Okay. In every single flood protection option, we note that if we choose flood protection, drainage throughout the city will need to be improved. And so we've got specific slides for that. So Joe, if you could just click on flood protection 1B.
Flood protection 1B. Where am I clicking? I'm sorry.
You've scrolled down, go back up.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, my apologies. There we go.
Okay. Under concerns or notes, this is hard to see on my screen. My eyes are not good enough.
I can read it out if you like.
No, that's okay, actually. We actually I may have caught myself out in an error here, and it will need to be added. But for every flood protection option, there should be a bullet point that says, under concerns and notes, drainage needs to be improved. And we have specific slides on here that demonstrate. So go back out of 1B, please. So click that little white arrow in the red bar, Joe. Thank you. And then click on 2A at Del Monte Lake. Yep. And click on the picture of that duckbill, please. That storm drainy looking thing.
Just here?
Yep. No, the photograph. Nope, go back.
Sorry.
That's okay. Go to 2A. Yep. And click on the photograph. Okay, so this is a device that stops the ocean from flowing backwards into the lakes when the lakes are lower than the ocean. It's called the duckbill valve. There are many other types of devices that keep that from happening. So this just does that. And then Joe, just to the right, there's a little forward white arrow that will take you to the next photo, just to the right of the duckbill photo.
Just give me 1 sec. There you go.
There, yep. And now here is an illustration that shows in the before, we've got flooded streets, and in the after, with improved drainage and backflow prevention, rainwater retention, and a new pump station. Those are the types of things that would be needed to drain the city either from rainwater or collected seawater under a flood protection scenario. So those would be needed no matter what we do.
Okay, I'm going to switch back to the presentation at this point. And go to the next question, which is, what transportation model are you using? Are you estimating changes in VMT and VHT across the network? And so, Frederick, that question is for you.
Thank you, Joe. So we have updated the travel demand model for the region with some information with city forecasting, and it is the 2040 horizon year. At this stage, all we're doing is looking at the diversion of traffic. So we basically looked at if a road is eliminated off the network, then reassignment happens on the model and it forecasts where the trips would go. We did not estimate congestion, VMT, or vehicle hours traveled. In the slides that we're showing you, there were substantial increases of on some roads 60%. Some of the local city downtown streets were well over 100%. The assessment of that increase in traffic is that there will be congestion occurring on several of the roads. The more roads, so in a later scenario where we lose Del Monte and Pearl and Fremont, basically we turn into gridlock on the system. The vehicles will want to go on all the local neighborhood streets as well to find their way, and the model clearly shows for us that there's just no capacity in the system to accommodate all the traffic that enters the city on a daily basis. So that's the analysis that we've shown here.
Thank you, Frederick. The next question is also for you, Frederick. Regarding locating or reconstructing these major roadways, this could take decades of planning, environmental reviews, public input, etc. If we do follow managed retreat, where will the traffic that travels Del Monte Avenue be moved to? If we don't want armored shorelines, where will Highway 1 be removed to?
Absolutely great question. So if Del Monte floods, right, what we see is that the traffic will firstly shift to Pearl Street. So that's the next option over for the trips into the city, and also heading to Cannery Row and Pacific Grove, and also up to Fremont Street. And then we do see Highway 68, the next road into the city. There's also access past the Del Monte Shopping Center, where traffic is also diverted to. So immediately the model, what we see in the modeling is that we have origins and destinations, right? And what the model says is, people live in one location and they work in another, and that's their travel need. And so the model will look for an alternative route to assign traffic to. So that's what we see. Regarding Highway 1, I think Caltrans is currently working with the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, looking at some resiliency plans for Highway 1. I haven't seen anything out yet on this bit of Highway 1 towards the City of Monterey. But they will also follow typical approaches of retreating. So if, let's say, they say, well, we don't want to keep Highway 1, and then the traffic needs to go elsewhere, right? So I think from the flood maps that we see here, is the scary part is that Del Monte and Fremont also gets flooded. So the next sort of option is really General Jim Moore Boulevard. If you allow for full retreat, the other option is again of doing an elevated Highway 1, so just raising the 4 lanes, and that would be similar to the viaduct picture that we saw illustrated for Del Monte Avenue.
Thank you so much. Rebecca, the next question is for you. The question is regarding where would the funding come from to do eminent domain or to acquire private properties that might need to be condemned or removed as part of this project?
Thank you for the question. I think the first and most important thing to say is that this study is not looking at eminent domain. It's not one of the options. Where we're looking at managed retreat, it would be willing sellers. Either managed retreat or flood protection will cost billions of dollars. There's no question at all about that. Maybe not in the immediate future, but over the long term. However, the costs of not responding to sea level rise are expected to be significantly larger than the costs of responding. We've seen this again and again with the large floods and the large hurricanes that we get on the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. Areas that did plan ahead and that were able to adapt prior to significant storm events saw different estimates, but a 9-to-1 damage to costs spent to avoid damage. When we look at the damage to New York from Hurricane Sandy, we were looking at $60 billion of damage to New York. The state had previously backburnered something on the order of $3 billion to protect the city for the same size of storm. And they chose not to do it at that time. And instead of spending $3 billion, they lost 60. So there's nothing that's cheap or inexpensive in the long term. In the short term, as I talked about, with those small areas of Del Monte at risk in the next 10 years, there are absolutely some less expensive options to consider as we raise money, as we apply for grants, as we find ways to move forward.
Thank you so much. The next question, Frederick, is for you.
Actually,
Oops.
Joe,
Sure.
I wanted to see if Kim might want to jump in and just also speak to the question of eminent domain or anything along those lines. Add to what I've said.
Thank you, Rebecca. Can you hear me?
We can.
Everyone? Great.
Yeah.
I'm Kimberly Cole. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Monterey. Our current municipal code actually prohibits eminent domain. So not only would it's not proposed in the plan, it's legislatively right now prohibited in our municipal code. And we have no plans at this point to pursue eminent domain.
Thank you so much. The next question, Frederick, is for you. So how were numbers of cars projected? Was it done using current numbers, and were mass transit projects future mass transit projects included in the calculations?
Thank you, Joe. Great question. So the numbers that we showed you is based on basically some passenger car travel on a daily basis, right? We did not show any solutions. This is basically an impact to the status quo, for 2040 conditions. If you go into the Survey Monkey that asks you a lot of questions, one of the options are definitely to have a great improvement to transit service into Monterey. Obviously, one can think that if you cannot get 100 or 60 cars in, right, at least you can get one bus in. So that's one of the options that we have to talk about. The modeling does not include or take into consideration transit services. The regional model has a transit component in it for transit ridership. It is actually fairly low. We're probably talking here around 5%. Yeah, so those are the results.
Thank you, Frederick. Rebecca, I'm hoping you might be able to answer this one. It's a great question. One of the members in the audience is keen to know how the wharves and piers can be protected.
That is a great question, and the risk to the wharves and piers is not identical for each one. Let's see. I want to ask Joe to bring up a slide here because I want to show you a really great resource for those who are interested. I'm just flipping through. Joe, can I have page 49, please? Okay, so Moffitt and Nickel is a really excellent consulting firm that did a wave damage study that was finished in May of last year, building on the work that Raval Coastal did to look at sea level rise base layers. And those are the two studies that our work on adaptation is being built on. There are about 20 pages, I might have that count wrong, in the Moffitt and Nickel report. This one is page 40, I can't read that page number right there.
28.
Page 28 of their report tells you exactly what the damage would be expected to be with a 100-year storm, or that storm that has a 1 in 100 chance of happening any particular year, with no sea level rise and at the 3 levels of sea level rise that we're considering. And it details what wave damage would occur to each of the piers. This page that I'm showing you is Old Fisherman's Wharf. Joe, flip to the next page. Municipal Wharf 2. It's got the Coast Guard pier. And so down here, oh, you can't see what my mouse is doing. Down at the bottom, there's a little item that says for adaptation. And that tells you what some of their ideas are for actually protecting the wharves, adding resilience to the wharves and the piers. The purpose of this particular study that we're talking about tonight is road transportation, unfortunately, not sea transportation. So we didn't include specific adaptation measures for each of these, but we do talk just a little bit about how we would connect the wharves and piers to existing transportation networks. And so that can be explored when you're exploring all the adaptation answers in the online maps. But I really would encourage you to read these specific pages of the Moffitt and Nickel report, because they give really clear language about which areas are more vulnerable to waves now, which have more time, and what some of those adaptation options could be.
Thanks, Rebecca. I think Kimberly might need to come in on this next question. So a member of the audience would like to know, is there a county-wide study also being done? What the level of coordination is between the city and adjacent communities?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of a regional study that's currently being done for sea level rise in the area. Pacific Grove, our adjacent city, did incorporate sea level rise into their local coastal plan update and have a series of strategies in that plan. But as far as I'm aware, I'm not aware that Sand City or Seaside or our adjacent communities or Monterey County are conducting a sea level rise study.
Great, thank you so much.
Joe, if I may. The state of California has done statewide studies. Their estimations of how fast seas will rise are a little bit higher than the ones in this study. And how fast seas rise does vary along the coastline for a number of technical reasons I won't get into. So the statewide study says seas will rise a little faster than our studies have. There's a lot of good information if you look for those. And some other communities along Monterey Bay have also done a number of studies and planning projects, not specifically, with Kim, I don't know of any next door to Monterey, but I know that Santa Cruz and some of the communities sort of north have also done a lot of work that's worth looking at.
I should add one comment to that. We actually started in 2008 regionally looking at the southern Monterey Bay, and there was a study completed by NOAA, and Dr. Revel helped with that study, looking at erosion mitigation alternatives for the entire southern Monterey Bay from the Salinas River towards Wharf 2. So we really started looking at that in 2008. When we started looking at that, it didn't really account for sea level rise. So there is a two-part study, a very good foundational study looking at various ocean processes and different information from Wharf 2 to the Salinas River, but it does not address sea level rise.
Hey, and Joe, the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments has a draft study report out right now. If you go to their website on ambag.org, it's called the Central Coast Highway 1 Climate Resiliency Study. So they specifically talk about Highway 1. So if you want to look at that, there's a good resource as well for regional travel.
And a member of the audience has reminded us that the City of Marina has done sea level rise planning focused on managed retreat. So it took a village, but I think we got some great answers there on that one. Thank you, everyone. We've got another question from the audience, Frederick, asking whether or not light rail is still being considered along the recreational trail, and if so, would that be impacted as well?
So light rail is, we don't have it discussed anywhere, but the tracks are still there, and I don't think it is being considered currently, and Kim can chime in on that one, but it runs sort of alongside and on top of the Monterey Bay City Trail. So, if Del Monte floods, the trail floods, and of course the trail tracks flood as well. I guess the question is if that's one of the mass transit systems that we're thinking of, and the viaduct is built, do you put the light rail system on top of the viaduct as a mass people mover to getting them into the city? Again, on the SurveyMonkey, for the online survey that you have to fill out, these are exactly sort of suggestions that we're looking for in getting some responses from you.
Thanks, Frederick. We've had a question just clarifying that we mean storm drains as opposed to sewers when we talk about sewer flows. And so I just wanted to confirm that we are talking about storm drains for this project.
Actually, both. Sanitary sewers, or what happens from the pipes in your house down to a treatment system, can also be vulnerable. They can be vulnerable in a variety of ways. There are some sewer lines that run adjacent to the coastline in areas that are significant erosion risks. Currently, we learned this from speaking with City Public Works in an earlier workshop we did with city staff to look at the maps and say, okay, if this flood happens, what concern does that raise for you? And we had Public Works there, and we had the fire department and the police department and various other departments represented so that we could hear from all the staff about their concerns. And the sanitary sewers were a concern. So both erosion damage to those pipes and manhole infiltration. And then storm drains are, that's just the water that falls on the street from the rain and a different set of pipes usually drains those straight out to the ocean. Sometimes through pumps if there's a very low-lying area, but I believe currently all storm drains in Monterey are actually gravity flow. So those would need to become pumped in the future.
I think it's important to understand that in our street system, quite often the sewer lines and the stormwater lines run close to each other or in a sort of in the same area. So if the stormwater line breaks, the sewer line typically breaks as well. We saw the picture of the sinkhole, right? So through that, the entire utility system actually gets damaged. And so that's why you can also have the backflow on sewer.
Good point. Thanks, Frederick.
Thanks, Frederick. Thanks, Rebecca. So currently that's all the questions that we've received tonight. I just thought we'd give it a couple more minutes to let members of the audience ask any additional questions, and just reminding you that you can submit questions via the questions pane, or you can hold off and give your feedback via the SurveyMonkey.
If we don't have questions coming in, I'd love to just give a quick overview of how to use those online maps.
Sure.
So if you could go back to the online map.
Sure thing.
And maybe we can show this as questions come in.
Just give me a minute to switch the sharing screen.
Sure. And we really recommend you take your time and explore those maps while you have the survey open. You can go back and forth to the maps, because we weren't there's so much information, it would be overwhelming to have it all in a single webinar. Joe, could you toggle off all of the red boxes that say flood protection? Turn those off. Leave that one. Yep, and turn off everything.
All the ones that say flood protection, my apologies. Sorry.
That's okay. Okay. So you're seeing some highlighted areas disappearing now. Keep going down. Get rid of managed retreat too. There you go. Now we've got nothing on here but flooding. And I want you to just feel like you can zoom way in. So Joe, do some zooming. Find a particular property that's of interest to you. So you can get a more detailed look about what areas would flood when. And Joe, can you turn off 5.2 and 2.4? So turn off the deeper floods. On the left-hand pane.
The deeper ones have been turned off.
There you go. Good. Sorry, it was slow to respond to me. Okay, so zoom back out a little bit. So we can see, yeah, that's about good. Okay, oh, that's way too zoomed. And let's just turn on flood protection at El Estero, please. Flood protection at El Estero. Okay, now here, a bunch of what looks like messy highlighter shows up. This is to show you the approximate locations. It's really important to understand. We are very high level, approximate. This is not engineering studies yet. And then each of these are a different color. And if you go to the left-hand pane and click on the names of any of them, so go ahead, Joe. Now you get your control panel changes to a description, and up at the top, there's an illustration. If you click on that illustration, you can see, oh, okay, that's where they're talking about. That yellow line says where they would put the levee, and then you click that forward arrow. Oh, okay, so here's the before. There's some dunes there now, but the ocean's going to cross those dunes. And if we raise the dunes in something that's called a narrow levee, that's an option to keep us dry for flood protection. And then click again. And now we've got what I call the ecotone levee, or a wider, more natural levee. So either a narrow levee or an ecotone levee would be options. Each of them have different pros and cons, but they could go in that location that the first image showed you. So as you go through each of these areas, now back out of 3A, there you go, and turn on 3B. Yep. Now, nope, go back a little bit. Yep, don't click on those images yet. I just want to talk about this. 3B is the thin purple line that runs, it actually should be moved up along La Playa Street instead of along, no, it's right. It's on the coastal trail. It's exactly where it should be. This is if the residents of La Playa say, you know what? If you're going to build a levee, we won't have sea views. Our insurance costs are going to go through the roof because now we're in a floodplain where we weren't before. We'd rather move. If that's the choice the La Playa residents make, then the city has the option to build the flood protection along the coastal trail instead of out where the current beach is. And so then if you click on that image show at the top, this is what that could eventually look like, and then keep clicking forward through those images. And again, you've got, so here's a narrow seawall instead of a levee, and then click forward again. And here's a wider seawall, and there's some costs and minuses of each of those as well. So just want to show you that's how the online maps work. And Joe, I'm going to turn it back to you, see if any other questions have come in.
So far, no additional questions. Hopefully everyone is finding it possible to access it. On top of that too, just reminding everyone that the handout that you can find in the handouts pane, that has the link to the survey and the map. And so just have a look at that handout because it can also show you how to use it, both the survey and the map. So just reminding about that. Does anyone have any questions? Getting lots of great questions just before, so. Or any technical questions, such as about the map or the survey.
Joe, this is Fernanda.
Hi, Fernanda.
Maybe could we put up that interactive map and survey PDF? Could we show it on the screen? Because for people watching on TV, they may want to write down the survey link.
Sure, just give me 1 minute.
Okay.
Okay, so here we go. So this is what the handout looks like. And so if you're actually just loading it on your computer, these are links that you can click on. So you can click on this one and it takes you to the Google map. And you can click on this one and it takes you to the SurveyMonkey survey. We really strongly recommend that you take the survey on your desktop computer or your laptop. We found that just with all the graphics that are involved, that it's much better to look at it on your computer. Now, here we realize these are some long links. So for the interactive map and for the survey one is a bit easier to follow. So we'll leave it up for just a couple of minutes, but we strongly recommend downloading this guide and clicking on the links through that. And the city can also publish the interactive map and the survey links on monterey.org/planning. And just reminding the audience that you can ask a question at any time. Okay, we haven't received any additional questions. give it another minute or so.
I want to thank the audience member who reminded us that Marina did choose managed retreat. There was actually really interesting article about that quite recently. Want to say it was in the San Francisco Chronicle, but I could be wrong. I'm actually gonna look it up. LA Times, actually, the article I read about Marina's choice to go for managed retreat rather than protection was February 24th of this year in the LA Times. But if you Google, you'll find a few other articles as well. So thank you for reminding us of that.
Fantastic. Kim, do you have any closing remarks before we end the webinar?
I just really want to thank everybody for tuning in this evening. We're really excited to receive your input and your ideas. So I can't emphasize enough, please fill out the SurveyMonkey document. If any of your friends were not able to listen tonight, information is on our website. Fill out the survey. So thank you so much for participating, and we're happy to and excited about your answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. And just reminding everyone that tonight's meeting was recorded and will be available later if you had to step away. And on top of that too, we'll be publishing all of the documents and handouts that you saw tonight. So thank you very much and have a great evening. Thank you. Bye.